A lot of people ask me how I get my line art to move like this on my model. Well, today I'm gonna tell ya. Hey, I'm Ray, and I'm gonna teach you how to do a line boil effect in Live2D. Let's get started. So generally, the concept of line boil itself comes from animation. It's a technique where you draw the outlines of the characters multiple times, which then when the character isn't moving or is holding a pose, you still get a little bit of motion as the lines wiggle from the general variance in the way that the art was outlined. So I take that concept and I use it in the actual art of this model here, where I'm doing the eyes multiple times, the outline of the character multiple times. I also go ahead and do the mouth multiple times, though that does significantly limit the way I'm able to rig this mouth, and I'll go into a bit more detail once we get into Live2D proper. But that's the general concept and way that I am achieving line boil in my models, is that I am drawing parts of it multiple times, and then animating those to go between the different variants in Live2D itself. There is a secondary technique that I will cover later in the video that's a little bit easier to work with and can make your model smaller, because as you can imagine, the more layers your model has, the bigger your model will be. So if you add a bunch of layers for just animation and flare, it's gonna add up quickly. My main model that I use all the time is gigantic. The program lags whenever I have to save it. So, keep that in mind if you're wanting to make a big model with line boil, that it does significantly impact the size of your model files. But generally speaking, the secondary technique is where you take your normal art layers that you would do like you would for any other model, and you take them into Live2D and you basically just kind of gently push them around to create a similar effect, but it tends to not look quite as convincing as traditional line boil, because it's not. It's kind of a shortcut line boil. I think that it's still pretty nice as a result, but it's just something to keep in mind. So when I'm working on this model, I go ahead and I triple the eye blacks, the eye whites, the outline of the mouth, the outline of the character, the highlight, and the shadow. I think I said that already. And I also make sure that I split all those up left and right, and that I go ahead and name them like IL1, IL2, IL3, and so on, so that once I'm in the program, it's very clear to me which layer is what part. The hardest part of this for me is probably not being able to actually see what it looks like, so I try to make sure that they're relatively similar so that the animation will look nice. But once we go ahead and get it into Live2D, we start with just kind of the general model setup. I go ahead and do clipping everything down, which I have to do, for all of the respective layers, because if I don't clip one of them, they will not all be clipped. So during the animation, you'll see shadow pop out. So you want to make sure that you can do that. You can do that easily by selecting multiple layers at once and clipping them all to the same ID. So that's usually what I do when I have multiple layers that I need to clip onto the same base layer. I go ahead and I set up the meshes, and then I set up our parameters. So I make one parameter called the line boil parameter, and there's this little technique in Live2D where if you only key something on one value, it'll only appear for that one value. Now, generally this isn't recommended, but for our purposes, this works great. So for all of the, I1, cheek 1, whatever the names of your layers are, I put them all on the first point of my line boil parameter, which I set up as starting at 1 and ending at the final number, just for the sake of ease. And so on each step in that parameter, I key each frame of animation, basically. Then we go into the animation, suite, and we animate going down those points. And normally it does a tween between the points, so you're gonna have slides between those points, which will be nothing. There's gonna be nothing in between. So we have to make sure that we set the animation technique to step. And what step does is that it makes sure that it just goes from one value directly to the next one. So the other more smooth transition is nice for a lot of movements, but in our case, it'll end up going 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and all of those in between points are again where we have nothing. So we want to make sure we just go straight from 1 to 2. And that's what doing step will do. I ended up changing some of the speed because I didn't like it by just changing the frame rate. I will note that this would mean if anything else is on the animation file, it would change the frame rate of that. And since you could only have a single idle animation per model, this would mean changing the other animations you have on your model. So you would need to be sure that all of your animations are in that same idle animation file if you need anything looping, like animated crying, or some people do animated sweating, or spinning eyes, things like that. They'd all need to be in the same animation file, because otherwise if you switched to a different animation, you'd either need to recreate your line boil, which would be fine, but it's just a bit painful, tedious, or you would lose your line boil animation, which I assume is not ideal. I did mention before that because I created multiple layers for the mouth, that I can't rig it directly. So what I ended up doing is I used deformers on the layers, so that all of the same like pieces of the model, so for example, lip 1, 2, and 3, are all handled in one deformer so that the movements are at least consistent across all of the layers. Now for the mouth, that does significantly limit the range of motion I can get without making a very heavyweight deformer, which I don't think is possible in things like the free version of Live2D. But I can kind of get a general mouth shape idea going by kind of using my rule of thumb of from the smallest mouth form, which would be like -1, your mouth is the thinnest, and then from the highest mouth form, so +1, your mouth is the widest. So I kind of go ahead and I just have the whole mouth do that shape. I do the mouth open, and then specifically for the negative, I try to have the lip curl up and with the corners of the lips curled down to kind of create that O shape. So I think that gets across a pretty decent mouth for not a lot of work. I want to say that I only had like maybe 5 total points across both mouth form and mouth open, which I think is pretty nice for like a mouth to be done in like 5 minutes. So that was the technique I used for that, to get the mouth working while still maintaining the line boil. Because what's important to note is that because you key the mouth or any of your lines that will change over the animation, you're gonna have to know that that can complicate things the more things you rig if you're rigging directly on the art mesh. Like I said, you may have to redo rigging if you're rigging directly on the art mesh, or you may have to make sure that your keys are set correctly. And the big thing for me is not wanting to redo rigging. I just think that, one, it's a lot harder to make sure that you rig it the same exact way every time, but 2, it's just extra work you don't need to do. So lean on deformers as much as you can if you want to end up doing the actual like multiple lines line boil effect, so you don't end up having to re-rig things multiple times. When it comes to this model that I'm rigging right now, I'm mostly just doing physics. I'm kind of just playing around with it, making sure everything's moving the way that I want. And overall, the rigging of this model is not much different than any other model, even though it has the line boil effect, which I know for a lot of people seems like really unique and out there. But like I said, it's mostly just a special idle animation and adding extra layers. I will have all of these files available in my VGen store for free if you would like to take a look or try rigging this yourself, messing around with the files. I tried to name everything as well as I could, but if you ever end up having any questions, feel free to DM me either on VGen or in my Discord. But generally, I'm just going ahead and, you know, rigging the angles for this little blob guy, which my Discord named Lav for lavender. This is Lav. And doing the left to right movements and everything. Because everything is contained within deformers, even though there's multiple layers within each, like, eye, we can go ahead and maintain that movement even among the animation. Now, I will say one helpful tip if you're doing this line boil and testing in the physics menu is that you can actually set up a animation playlist in the physics menu and play your animation while you're testing the physics or the rig of the model. And I did that a lot when testing this model as well as the model that I actually use to see the line boil and how it interacted with the rigging itself. Because normally you can only see your animation within the animation, like, tooling. So if you're in the physics setting, you go to add a playlist. It'll probably just name it like new playlist 0 or whatever. Name does not matter. It does not need to be saved. Not important. And then you need to make sure you have both the model open and the animation open so that Live2D can see the animation file that you're working on. And then you will add that animation to your playlist, and then up at the top where you have the like different things that you can do, like posing, you instead pick the animation, and it'll probably be like scene 1, and you pick that, and then it'll play your line boil animation. This will mean that you can't use the random posing and the line boil at the same time, but I find that that's kind of a decent trade-off, especially with the updates that let you hook up VTube Studio to Live2D directly so that you can actually track with your model while you're working. For the most part, I find it to be a bit annoying that you can't do both at the same time, but if you ever need to change to the like random posing, you can. You just have to switch off of your playlist in scene 1, and then it's not a big deal. So now I'm going to quickly go over the secondary method that you can do for the line boil effect and how I go about rigging it. So the secondary effect, as I mentioned, is basically you just put a deformer over the pieces that you want to rig that'll basically be like directly on top of the art layers themselves, as if the art layers themselves were deforming. I will mention that it will limit how much the art underneath it can deform, so I'd recommend making it as detailed a deformer as you're able to. The general recommendation is 9x9. I believe that's also the limitation in the free version, because anything is a little heavy. And then go in and kind of just, with the brush tool is what I like to use, push some of the little indents in the deformer itself to create that kind of wiggling effect. And then go ahead and do the same animation process, where instead of tweening, you'll want to make sure that it's doing the step effect. Now, I will mention that I went ahead and did the body as one piece of this deformation, and then the face as another, so that I could get a little bit more detail in how it was wiggling. But for the most part, there's not a whole lot to know, other than just to have that same parameter that you have each step of the animation, which is basically like gonna be one frame. Regardless, I hope this was helpful. This is how the model turned out. I think it's really, really cute. And if you would like the files to either test the model for yourself or see how I rigged it, go into a little bit more detail. Both techniques have a variation available on my VGen store, so if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments or any of my other locations I mentioned before. And regardless, thanks for watching, and have a great day! I've been Ray! Bye-bye!